Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's Talent Visionaries live stream. The Talent Visionary series brings together leaders in talent acquisition, HR, DEI, and real conversations about the most important topics facing our industry today. I'm your host for today's event. My name is Richard Cho. I go by Cho, pronouns he, him. I'm the Chief Recruiting Officer at JAM. And before JAM, I spent some time being an talent acquisition leader at places like Robinhood and Facebook, now called Meta, Dropbox, and Cisco. I am joined today by my good friend Y-Vonne Hutchinson, the CEO at ReadySet, and an author of an incredible book I highly recommend called How to Talk to Your Boss About Race. So I want to welcome Y-Vonne. Hi, Y-Vonne.
Sorry about that. Rookie virtual mistake. How are you doing, Cho?
I'm doing so well, Y-Vonne, and that's the common thing, right? I'm gonna wear a shirt that says "You're still on mute." That's the thing that happens in the virtual world.
Yeah.
Y-Vonne, every time I talk about you, which I talk about you a lot, I'm so inspired by your journey, the intentional decisions that you've made throughout your career. Despite having a world of different opportunities. Love to hear, if you don't mind, in your intro, to share a little bit about your journey and how you got into this work.
Yeah. So my background, and I whenever I hear this question, I'm like, how far back do I go? So I'll just go a little bit of a ways back. But my background originally is in international human rights law and labor rights advocacy. So I started my career working abroad, and I kind of sort of migrated from, I would say, these sort of situations of acute violence. So I was working in conflict zones. I was working in Afghanistan. I was working on the border of Thailand and Burma, where there was sort of the longest protracted civil war happening, a refugee crisis happening there, and gradually moved towards situations where there was structural violence. So in my last role, I was working with sugarcane workers in Nicaragua who were dying of occupational illness. And what really struck me there is I was so used to seeing like the impact of war, the violence of wartime. And in that case, I was in a sort of peaceful environment, but these workers were really suffering and they were dying at these alarming rates. And I saw the power of structural violence there. And I saw the tragedy of these workers who were going to work every day to feed their families, to live, in hopes that their children would have better opportunities, knowing that they were also sacrificing themselves. to do that. So that really kind of shifted my thinking. I've always been really obsessed with these ideas of like justice and how do we have a positive impact. Truly thinking about something that is as commonplace as work and how that can be a vector for opportunity or harm. I was originally going to go get like a PhD to study it because I've always kind of bridged academia and the professional world, but uh, much to my parents' chagrin, I decided not to do that and to start a company instead. That company is ReadySet. And I started that company because I really believe that DEI is the future of work issue. When we're talking about the nexus of harm and opportunity, in a lot of ways, we're talking about DEI. When we talk about impact, we're talking about DEI. When we're talking about the future of work, we're talking about DEI. And so that's why I started ReadySet. And I guess that's kind of what launched me into this work.
You had a perfect segue into why you're so passionate about this particular space too. So I won't ask that question, but I am so lucky to say that I know you. I mean, every time you tell your story, I'm inspired, especially with your drive to ensure that equity and justice occurs not only in the world but also in the workplace. So thank you for that. That's it's always invigorating for me to hear again. So I'm going to shift to parts of the topic, and the title for today's discussion mentions building authentically diverse organizations, which is actually intentional wording. What does that look like in practice as leaders? How can we help our organization get there?
Yeah, and I'm glad that we're in conversation. I'm excited to hear your answer to this question as well. I want to kind of go back to something you said earlier, though, about the passion for the work, because I believe that I answered your question from an intellectual place and a place of curiosity, and that's certainly true. But I also think that my identity and my personal story plays a role in terms of the passion as well. I have been in organizations that weren't authentically diverse, organizations that were toxic, organizations that didn't value my voice. And in starting my own company, one of the commitments that I made to myself was I don't want anybody to have that experience again, right? Like I want to be able to open doors for people and to help eradicate cultures that really punish people and are cruel to people and make them feel worse about themselves. So when I think about the emotional side to the work, that's where I'm coming from. So I want to hold that, and then I want to answer your question about building authentically diverse organizations and what does that look like in practice. So I feel like the word authentically is really doing the work here, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say as well. I feel like authentically is really doing the work here because a lot of times with diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, it can feel like a check the box exercise, or it can feel like we're doing something as an add-on. We're doing something that's optional. We're doing people a favor. And when I think about authenticity, I think about a diverse, inclusive, representative organization that has this embedded into its DNA, that sees it as a talent priority, as a business priority, a strategic priority, and plans accordingly. I see an organization that at all levels of the hierarchy has representation, inclusion, belonging, where there is shared power amongst different groups, right? So we're not just seeing diversity at the entry level, we're seeing it at the leadership level, we're seeing it at the board level. And an organization that views this as an existential question, that understands that its future success, particularly in the current social and economic environment, is contingent on getting this right. And so they do that in a way that feels true to themselves, right? In a way that isn't just about buzzwords or social media posts or hopping on the latest bandwagon, but it's really sort of true to what their overall vision is. So that's kind of what I think about it. But I want to hear what you have to say as well.
Yeah, look, this actually probably was a little bit of like self-preservation because unfortunately, recruiting teams or talent acquisition teams have an outsized role in diversifying organizations. Uh, and when I realized that companies are just not getting there, the diversity debt actually gets larger over time, not smaller. We're not paying down that diversity debt. It has a lot to do with what you just said around, is the company really bought in to be authentically diverse? Um, there's a true trickle down effect. And it took the unfortunate instances in 2020 that really forced companies to rear its ugly head. At the core of a lot of organizations, diversity, DEI and B, it was a feel good initiative, not necessarily core to who they are. And no one, everyone gets sort of partially there. We get organizations bought in, we get employees bought in, we might even get some leaders bought in. But at the very top, and you said it perfectly, from the board to the founder, all the way down, um, there may be a ulterior motive that unfortunately is at conflict with authentically diverse. Despite all the academic research around better companies, better thought decision making, despite all the the information around, you build better products because you have folks with lived experiences in the communities in which you're serving. There's still this bias that plays out. So yeah, so that's really what I mean by authentic, is like you need to transform the organization from inside out. And I think that's some of the work that we've done in the past at other companies that I'm really excited to dig into and share with this audience. So to that end, for many years, I remember when ReadySet was, I think, 4 or 5 people. Now it's this worldwide sensation and it's successful for a lot of reasons, but it was successful for many reasons that you personally taught me this notion of transforming from inside out, top to bottom, have the difficult conversations. Then you start to think about the systems of biases. So we've been talking about attracting diverse talent for so many years now, and with that, I've always said, like, look, diversity is not a pipeline issue. That's the easy thing, because it's unreasonable to assume that folks the top 10 schools in whatever vertical has the monopoly on the smartest people in the world, and we could talk about that. But we said it's a selection issue. It's the biases that come into play, and a lot of stuff I learned through you and your company. So if it's about the hiring process, rarely is it inclusive or equitable. Can you share your view about what to do to fix this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I have like kind of good news and bad news. I think the good, and it's the same news, which is that like nobody's really gotten this right. I think organizations, it's just really tough to recognize talent. And one of the impacts of that difficulty and our inability to really do that is sort of a lack of diverse, inclusive organizations, over reliance and pattern matching, and frankly, like a lot of wasted resources. I think that your point is right. I don't think it's a pipeline issue. In fact, I think what happens is like people's hiring practices actually harm their pipeline as folks start to kind of talk about their experiences with organizations. More often, what you're dealing with inside of an organization is, number one, just old fashioned bias, right? An idea that talent looks a certain way, talks a certain way, and there are certain discussions that you can't have about people or what they bring to the table, that impede kind of broadening that lens, And I think the way that we assess talent is quite rudimentary, right? We look for the right schools, we look for certain work experiences, we look for the right boxes that we check, and then we look for that personal connection, and we never really think what these are proxies for, and we rarely take a cold hard look to say, what does it really take to be successful in this role in this organization, and what would it take to be additive, right? Not to just to kind of replicate what we already have on the team, but to build and expand. And what might not we be seeing? And I think as we go forward in this particular time, it's becoming even more crucial that we get that, because we're bringing in people who may be the right people, but then don't survive within our organizations, then attrit. And then we have, a hiring, we have a deficit of talent. We have a brand deficit, right? And it makes our jobs even that much harder. I think it's this work of talent attraction and hiring and debiasing our processes goes hand in hand to developing cultures of inclusion and making sure that we have decision makers that represent the talent that we want to attract as well, right? Because I think, and I'm specifically speaking to recruiting teams here, you can be in a really tough spot, right? If you're being encouraged to recruit quickly, you're being incentivized to get the butt in the seats, you're being given these metrics, and at the same time you're being told that there's something that's of value to the company, but there's no metric attached to it, or you're getting pushback that's not quite visible to everyone. In the end, you're going to default to the lack of diversity anyway. So I think it's really important that as companies emphasize diversity in their recruiting processes, their hiring processes, they're also thinking about how are we evaluating talent, who's making decisions, how are we really developing incentives for the teams under us, and then how are we bringing in those voices that already represent the talent that we want to have. So that's kind of how I think about it.
So well said. I wanted to snap all the way through, but
how do you think about it, though, Che? I want to hear
Yeah. So two things I want to highlight in what you said, and I want to share a story because that's what I like doing that as the old guy in the room. I always share stories to make a point. But one of the things that you talked about as far as the inability to actually really revise the selection process, focused on true things that are additive, was brilliant, because that is the net positive when people think about their selection process, which ultimately at the base of it is de-risking a hire. No one can truly tell you this person is going to be successful or not, but you pattern match to de-risk the hire. And ultimately that person's not additive, or there's nothing in the interview process that shows that they're additive. The other thing that you said that was just perfectly articulated, and we're now seeing it in the entire talent community, is when employees see that companies are not actually authentically committed to diversifying the organization, broaden viewpoints, creating psychologically safe environments for everyone to grow and thrive, they'll decide to leave that company. And we've seen that in the great, whatever you want to call it, resignation, reshuffle, and so those things actually really hold true. So story time. Look, I will also just humbly say that in this talent acquisition role, as I became a leader of talent acquisition, this is an initiative that I've tried 3 times, failed, 2 times miserably, and got the 3rd time half right. And I call it half right because you have to constantly work on this. And the reason why we got the 3rd half right is because of the help from Y-Vonne and her team at an organization that was very committed to diversifying the organization. And that was at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative many, many years ago. So one of the companies that shall go nameless, we wanted this to be a most important initiative. And so we invested in Code 2040. And in fact, we thought we can short circuit the hiring process because some of the Code 2040 interns were already at their respective companies. And these are companies like Twitter and Facebook and Google, like all the companies that you would probably hire from. And we had the bright idea to short circuit the process, interview these interns. And so maybe we can swoop in and capture these incredibly brilliant young minds. And guess how many people passed the interview process? 0. And it has nothing to do with these brilliant interns that already had return offers, full-time offers at companies that we would hire from. And the underlying message from that company was, go get your experience at Twitter, and then we'll hire you afterwards. So there's something fundamentally broken about the selection process that I think that we all need to fix. And to your point, also, when you first started, no one's really figured this out. And it'll be my very last thing that I do that we get further along in this, obviously together, Y-Vonne, because this is actually a really important thing to solve for. I want to switch topics just for a second, because I think it would be remiss if we didn't address today the economy, the things that are sort of happening all around us. You can't turn on the news without hearing the economy, this and that, and the other thing. We've personally surveyed and seen over 300 companies have had layoffs, and then others are kind of waiting and seeing. And this is not just a tech thing; it's across the board. Now, in my experience, this has an outsized impact to diversity initiatives. I'm trying to market that this is the perfect time to actually triple, quadruple your efforts there. But I'd love to hear from you. What are some things that you're thinking about, how your company is also helping companies, prioritize this commitment to bringing in great talent, diverse talent in times like this?
Yeah, I think about this time a lot because and I'm so sick of saying something's unprecedented, but in a lot of ways, geriatric, I guess, millennial. So the very oldest kind of millennial that you can find in the wild. And I have been through at this point, maybe this is my third recession. And I say that because this is also the recession that looks the least like all of the other recessions because it's happening in the midst of these once in a generation, once in a century, once in a lifetime unprecedented shifts, right? And these shifts all affect um, our economy and the way we live and how we show up in the workplace to a lesser extent. And I think were this 2007, 2008, were this 2099, 2000, my answer would be very different because the political, social, economic environment was a lot more stable, a lot more precedented. I say that to sort of lay out this picture. I don't know. And I always feel limited by the words diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging because it seems so narrow when what we're talking about is the fundamental experience of working and the impact of organizations, which are some of, businesses, some of the most powerful entities on the planet, on society. Like that's really what we're talking about. That's what is at this nexus. And when we think about how we show up at work and how businesses navigate this climate, this is totally at the heart of it. Whether it's the sort of generational shift that's happening in the workforce and the multi-generation workforce, the addition of Gen Z and their totally new experiences, new perspectives, new expectations, skepticism, and like just high, beliefs that they want to be part of something good, whether it's that, whether it's the renegotiating of our work-life balance in a post-COVID era, the hybrid workforce, working from home versus working in person. This is going to sound really depressing, but navigating what's been, in a sense, a mass debilitating event of COVID, thinking of all the people with long COVID that still need to go to work and need to navigate their brain fog and the physical impacts of the disease, climate change, and what that means for just the stability of our physical and built environments, and then political instability and these sort of political movements that are identity based that have a very negative effect on populations outside of our workforce, but also the populations that are coming in, and companies now having to fill these gaps in the absence of social structures that would be a little bit more resilient. I don't see a world in which DEI is optional in that context. I don't see a business that's able to shut all of these different vectors out to operate business as usual that's going to be able to grow. I personally think that in this current environment, I don't necessarily wish this was the case. I like kind of am not a big fan of like huge corporate power, but I think that business has a stabilizing role to play, uh, just because of the circumstances that we're in right now. And we can't play that role. This community can't play that role without being able to acknowledge what's happening and how to have a strategy to account for it. So when I think about this environment, that's how I think about DEI. I think about it as an existential question, as a social responsibility question, and frankly, as a securing the future question that we have to get right. We have to answer.
Again, so right. And I always get inspired, talking to you, and I feel like I've been monopolizing your entire time. I failed to mention to the audience that you will have an opportunity to ask Y-Vonne questions directly, and I highly recommend it, as you're hearing phenomenal answers from Y-Vonne. But just to add, I think people forget that the part of our identity is talking about where we work and what we do. And we need to have not only pride in doing that, but we also need the ability to be able to have safety in identifying with those companies. It wasn't that long ago that companies felt like employees were at service for the company itself. And if you're feeling bad, that's on you. Maybe we'll give you some benefits. If you have any opinions about the political climate, the economic climate, or just in the environment in general, you know what? Keep that at home. But now we're shifting to the fact that like our identities are absolutely being challenged, and people have to make these decisions around, do I have this job that I don't know? It's clear that the CEO is at conflict with my values. What do I do now? And to your point, the responsibility of the company is so much bigger now. There's investments in publicly traded companies talking about their social good practices. Talent Brand is focusing on how companies are positioning themselves against some of the social news that has been unusual. When I started in work many years ago, dinosaurs roamed the earth. So what great advice, and it's really important for companies to know that. So looks like we got our first question from the audience. If you don't mind making it a short shift, and thank you for your question, Kelsey. As a third-party recruiter, how do you correctly let clients know that their candidate requirements are discriminatory? They often want only specific candidates, and it's hard to tell them no when they're a huge account. Any advice? And I love this question for you because this is what
I mean, I think that's a very tough position to be in, particularly if you're like working on a contingent basis, and I think you're a lot more sort of vulnerable to the client whims. But I usually dig into a few things with clients to kind of get them to what they want a little bit more deeper. Number one, when I look at requirements, I really like to are these successful for the job that you have, or are these things like, what are you trying to account for? What is this a metric for that you're trying to get to? Okay, so you're saying, and I come from the world of law where it's incredibly discriminatory. We'll only consider somebody, for example, from an Ivy League law school. What are you trying to get to with that? What is that Ivy League education supposed to be a marker for? Because in my experience, it's how well you take the LSATs and how well connected your parents are. Do you instead want someone who has clinical experience? Do you need somebody who has a certain level of specialization? Are you looking for something different? Are you actually looking for somebody who has kind of grit and creativity? That might be the exact opposite thing that you get from somebody who comes from an elite environment. I work a lot with startups, and when startups talk about, we want somebody from these big tech companies because we want to, these legacy companies because we want them to understand XYZ. Well, that's great, but at this point, if you're talking about Google and Meta, these people have been working. These are huge multinationals, and if you're a little startup, you actually want somebody who's flexible, who's nimble, who's creative, who can work with limited resources. Somebody from Google, I mean, they can do a lot of things, but I don't know if they're the best placed person to do that. So I usually try to sit with them on that and really try to see, are you going to get what you're looking for, or are you recruiting for elitism, which at the end of the day isn't going to serve you? And then I also talk about, well, who's done well here and who's done poorly? What have they said? And kind of where do you want this team to go in the aftermath of this hire, right? And really try to kind of vision that way. In some ways, in this, there's a lot of defensiveness around the DEI conversation. I think if I start by telling someone you're discriminating, in some ways I shut the conversation down pretty early on. Now, I want them to get to that point, but it's kind of like I want to lead that horse, not like our clients are horses, but lead that horse to water to get them to drink it. And I don't want to get them started from a defensive place. And so starting from a place with curiosity, starting to get them to really nail down what success is, starting to get them to really vision around the role and get excited, starting to get them wanting something different, and then moving them to that slate that is a not traditional slate, that is not the slate that they would normally see, that's a more diverse slate. That's how I would approach it. But Cho, I'm curious to hear your answer.
There's only one thing to add, but what a brilliant answer. And again, I learned a lot of this through Y-Vonne and our company too. But making sure you have an objective approach to understanding what you need in the organization is absolutely step one. Step two, then even as a third-party recruiter, you should repeat back the data around the people that they've consistently interviewed. How many of them are actually moving to on-sites? What is the background? Are they Ivy League versus state school? Just so they have the information. And these two things start to blend to each other, which creates that aha moment where you're leading the hiring manager, the horse to water, if you will. And then I always add, because I love storytelling. I'm a storyteller. When we're talking about all the things that Y-Vonne was mentioning at a startup, where you need to have persistence, you need to be able to navigate ambiguity, you need to be able to juggle multiple things at any given time. And these gray hairs will show you that the last 14 years, I've only focused on hypergrowth companies. And it requires a certain level of grit to be able to survive that environment. And so I remember telling a story about two students that the professor really highlighted at UC Merced, which is a California public university, and it's in the Central Coast section where we have a high population of migrant workers. And because I want to talk about them as highly qualified students, I'll leave out because I'm not looking to talk about their race as the reason for this. The reason for this conversation was to talk about these two 4.2 GPA students in computer science at UC Merced would work early in the morning, starting at 4 a.m., go to school, have a full workload, go back to work, and then rinse and repeat all over again. And in my mind, as I'm doing the math, it's not clear when they get sleep. And they're more than 4.0 students. And if I think about grit, if I think about folks that actually are really set up to be successful, it's those kids that I think about all the time. Not the student who is third generation MIT, all the access and alumnus groups available to that student. I care about that student too, but if we're talking about grit, I would probably bet on the UC Merced kids 100 out of 100 times. And that is something that I think, storytelling with data and creating objective selection process those things actually create that environment where you can allow your hiring managers to have the aha moment. So thank you for that question.
Can I just build on that? I think also what I'm hearing with the storytelling piece is I think there's a chance in our roles to create this sort of emotional investment. That's what I hear when you're saying that sort of aha moment is I think to get your client to invest in that vision, to share in that vision and be excited about it to what Cho is saying, I think can be really, really powerful. And in a certain instance, I feel like now more than ever, people are open to that because we're coming out of the great resignation. We're coming out of this turmoil and we just want something better. We want something to be excited about. And I think rather than going from a place of conservatism or fear in terms of how we approach presenting candidates to clients, coming from a place of optimism and excitement and saying, look, didn't we learn all of this from the past 2 years? Let's try this new, different person. Let's try rethinking talent in this way. I think there's an opportunity there. So, yeah.
Awesome. Y-Vonne, I want to go back to what you said, because this is also something that I'm thinking about all the time, which is this return to office. Hybrid, is it remote? There's pros and cons to each area, and explicitly there's still concerns around COVID and now monkeypox. I don't want to. We can't handle another pandemic, by the way. But I also realized that the silver lining was that people could work from anywhere. And so access to jobs was really borderless. And then the inference there is that, maybe it did have a positive impact to those that had lack of access or unable to live in the high price areas that tech is, and so on and so forth. I'd love to hear a bit about return to office, hybrid, whatever, how, it has some impact on, the ability to attract and retain underrepresented groups. Can you share why this might be and what's at stake here?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're still really trying to figure this out, but I share your observation that in a lot of ways, remote work created an opportunity. Just a personal story for me as CEO, prior to COVID, ReadySet was kind of hybrid. We had a few looks, but for the most part, we were situated in the San Francisco Bay Area. We definitely had a bias towards that. And we were moving to in-person. And there was a lot of talk about, do we do more in person, et cetera. But that really limited the way that we were able to work together. I think in some ways it limited our creativity and it limited our access to talent. And I think it limited even the kind of personalities that we were able to recruit. When 2020 happened, we also had an explosive growth phase at that time. We more than tripled in size over the period of the pandemic up until now. And I think we became really just geographically diverse. We became in a lot of ways more racially diverse. We became more gender diverse, which to me was a big shock. But I think what we found was just there were people who and traditionally trans and non-binary folks, they face a ton of hurdles when it comes to economic participation and getting hired. And we had more access to those folks as well. And so I think for us, it became a really important part of our culture. And so many of us, myself included, became parents at that time. And I can't tell you, as a parent, it is a double-edged sword, because I don't know if you can hear, but my 2-year-old's throwing blocks up the ceiling of me. I'm trying to do this event. So okay. But also, once I go log off of the screen, I get to go upstairs and hug her and spin her around and maybe take her out to lunch. And I can be a present parent in a way that I can't be otherwise. And particularly in this environment where there is COVID in school. She's home now because her school had a COVID scare. It is super important for me to have that flexibility. And the same is true for a lot of parents that we have. So I think, where ReadySet has landed with this is that we have a few in-person meetings. I think that those bonding opportunities are great. We do regionally based activities. We may do an annual retreat if it feels safe COVID wise. And the bulk of our work is remote. That is the balance that works out for us. What we're seeing with our clients is they're really trying to navigate hybrid. Not a lot of people like hybrid, like the people that want to be in the office. There aren't enough people to make being in the office attractive, and the people who want to be remote, they're not, they feel pulled into the office. I don't think that there's a clear answer there, but I do think that remote work offers a lot of opportunity in terms of diversifying access, getting more lived experience. Like that's the whole point, right? And even if you have Black, brown people from LA and New York, they're still like coastal folks, right? Like you want to get people from the Texas, Louisiana, you want to hit Atlanta, you want to hit DC, you want to understand Ohio, right? Like you want that kind of national workforce. And if you're global, you want access to global talent as well. And I think as we're sort of seeing this kind of rapid, I don't know what to call it, but this kind of segregation, separation in terms of what the reality is like living state to state, there's going to be more of a need for this kind of flexibility. And as we're seeing sort of things like housing costs rise, you're not going to be able to be reliant on the urban centers like you could rely on in the past. So, I think given the current environment, remote work offers a lot of great opportunity. And I think companies should dive into that.
Yeah. Yeah, so right. I mean, so you touched on this specifically, breaking down, the different dimensions that describe a human, whether you're a parent, trans, non-binary, and everyone needs different. Everyone requires different accommodations. What we've found is that in many of not only our customers, but just in the market in general, folks that tend to be closer to college graduation age crave some of that physical close connection. Obviously there's always the exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, that generation really likes to have that community because they're just building out their social network, if you will. Parents love and now need, almost demand. I want to use some stronger words because I think it's clear in the data that people are willing to leave jobs that are inflexible to jobs that are, and many companies, especially the big companies, are offering that level of flexibility, so they know they have choices despite whatever economic environment we're in. People still have choices to where they would want to work, and so companies have to remain flexible in order to be competitive. In addition, if you are going to be flexible, I think companies need to invest also. Now we have all these like fancy tools, but it requires a little more bandwidth in internet. So internet stipends are really important because, talk about, one area where you can create, a classist kind of environment is when you're not supporting your employees to ensure that access and participation is equal. And a lot of companies are now also investing in when I have people in the room physically and I have people on screen, how do I encourage everyone to participate? I do think the return to office is some sort of hybrid, and it's here to stay, actually.
I totally agree. I would also say that in addition to the access question, I think intentionality around when we do come together and how we come together is really important. I think for so long in our workplace cultures, meetings just kind of almost meetings served as management, and really thinking about how we leverage our time together when we're coming together socially, when there's a networking opportunity, yet how do we not ask people to be in meetings too much? I think is also I think it's an opportunity, right? Because like prior to being intentional about our touch points, even if we were all present in the office, those social dynamics were still biased and prejudiced in favor of people from certain groups. And so if we can take a step back and say, okay, how do we create intentional and equitable touch points, leveraging the fact that we're in this hybrid environment, I think there's an opportunity to build in more equity there as well.
Yeah, well said. Let me take a question from the audience. It's from Lee Yi. How can companies promote DE and I more, and what are effective strategies to do so? And this is actually a very timely question, because as companies are reducing spend and pulling back certain initiatives, those companies that are truly see DEI and B as a feel-good initiative might make those trade-offs. So how do you ensure that it still stays top of mind, and what are some good strategies?
Yeah, I think I'm going to try to go really tactical with this answer, because I think we've kind of set the stage already by saying it's kind of the DEIB, especially now, is an existential question. But I think the tactical element is, how do we do that? I think first we need to really look closely at our budgets and how we allocate the resources that we have. So I think we sort of take it as a given that the DEIB budget is always going to be small, but I think there is a question for leaders that if talent, like retaining talent is important, if making sure that talent is leveraged effectively, because you just can't recruit everybody into everything, and understanding that churn costs a lot, if that's really important, and if we want to prioritize things like accessing new markets to generate new revenue, et cetera, how do we think about how we're budgeting and framing DEIB as part of that? So at the leadership level, I would reimagine that budget, reimagine that resource allocation, and really rethink how we prioritize it. At the strategic level, I kind of sort of think about diversity, equity, and inclusion as embedded in a lot of ways into our DNA. I think structurally, we still need somebody who owns that. There's a lot of critique about the head of DEI role or the CDO officer. I think that critique is fair, but I think organizationally, there has to be some ownership of the strategy as embedded into other strategies, or else it's going to fail. I also think, and I'm giving a lot of recommendations for leaders, I'll go down the chain. I also think that there need to be not just metrics attached to this, but ideas for how do we incentivize success and failure here, right? So how do we create true accountability here? If we're thinking about things like layoffs, I frankly think that if you are looking to streamline who's on your team or whatever, for me, I think that people who are bad for your culture are bad for your company, particularly in hard times. And I think that there are companies that I won't name here that have actually developed some toxic cultures that are crumbling now that things are tough. And what you want to do is really optimize for the people who are going to support your culture and support each other. And I think part of that is going to be making tough talent decisions that incorporate DEI as opposed to saying this is optional. I think there's a question of also resourcing your internal, your internal groups. So I think this is the ERG moment, right? And ERGs have been asked to do so much in these past 2 years with such little resources. But I also think, when I think about ROI, I think about how do we equip ERGs to support employees? How do we give them tools to do their work better? How do we give them the budgets that we need? And how do we be more explicit with their mandate? So it's not just about events. It's not just about recruiting. I mean, ERGs are like supporting employees right now. They're really kind of helping. How do we give them the resources that they need? And I still think that there's room for external expertise. And I understand, as a service provider, you're probably not going to have that 6-figure budget to bring in the consultant. It makes me shed a tear, but I still think there's opportunities to strategically engage with partners who have that expertise to build your capacity. I think investing in leadership training so that you can build something sustainable, doing some train the trainer work so that you can carry this forward in your organization, investing in tools. And now there are tools and consultants sort of there are companies that do both. ReadySet is one of them, where you can really think about how do we understand our organization better and kind of build a strategy with this tool, with this organization, et cetera. And then one of the things at ReadySet that we're doing, and I'm going to use this as a little bit of an opportunity of self-promotion, is that, having just talked about the hybrid environment, we're really thinking about what does it mean to scale hybrid learning and to support individual learners. And so we've launched a learning platform. There are others like us, but that's a lot cheaper necessarily than getting some huge organization-wide training, is sort of investing in ongoing lightweight online experiences that can still carry this work forward. And I think particularly in this resource constrained environment, you can't just do that, throw it all against the wall and walk away. You've got to be able to figure out how to measure the impact and the ROI so you can continue to make the business case going forward. So as you sort of think about these resource informed approaches to creatively engaging in DEI, also think about how am I going to measure success at the end of the quarter, at the end of the year, so that when I have to go back and request new budget from leaders in this environment, that I can show the ROI on what I've already done, because that's what they're going to be thinking about. So I'll pause there, but Cho, I would love to hear from you on this too.
Just adding two things, and let's not mince words. DEI&B is not just a feel-good strategy; it's actually a retention strategy, y'all. Companies have lost incredible talent. Not just from the historically underrepresented communities, but from allies who are having this discussion internally saying, I'm at a company who talks the talk, but does not, walk the walk. Like they don't put their money where their mouth is, where it really means if it's important to me. So I'm going to go find a company that believes in that. And don't let, this sensation of layoffs and reduction assume that people are going to stay put. Great employees will always have opportunities to find companies that are more aligned to their mission and values. And if you do not invest in DEI&B, you will lose your best employees. So that's point number one. Point number two, and this is mostly to if they say, what is a business case? This is one. Point number two is what I've seen in this sort of interesting phenomenon that occurs during a down economy is that from your new grad who's getting advice from their parents and career counselors, all the way up to the most senior, most experienced professional, during a down economy, you go towards a sure bet. So what you see is companies like the legacy companies like Microsoft, Apple, Meta will get an outsized share of their talent, and smaller companies, including companies like my own Gem, we will have less of an opportunity at that great talent unless we tell our authentic story about what matters to us. And DEI&B is at the core of who we are. We're not just doing it for us, but we also want to really inspire all industries through the work that we do in sharing incredible insights from thought leaders like Y-Vonne in today's Talent Visionaries series. That's a perfect example. And talk about the implications around how this impacts your company's ability to succeed. And people is the number one thing that allows your company to succeed. And if you divest, because DEI&B was not only the smallest budget, but it was a feel-good budget, there's going to be a direct impact in your ability to continue to attract and retain your best talent. So that's really the only thing to add to what Y-Vonne shared.
Can I actually ask you a question? And I'm just curious to hear how you're thinking about this, Cho, because you sort of mentioned, and I think you're absolutely right, people tend to be more risk averse. They go to the bigger companies. But I'm also mindful, without naming anyone specific, that some of these companies have had layoffs or hiring freezes and have not handled them really well, or brought in, you know what I mean? And I'm curious, is as we sort of think about the great renegotiation and how talent is now like really valuing that trust
Mhm.
and really valuing those values. How do you sort of see the opportunity there?
Yeah, I mean, this is the true colors moment. We started seeing this in 2020 when companies lacked a response or incorrect response really started to show the true colors of the organization's values. Um, so, there will be some set of employees that, despite how horribly some of these large legacy companies have handled layoffs or even other issues within the company, they'll still join them because of whatever values that resonate with them. And then there are others that will have that discussion internally. I know of a really large company where I'm starting to see a high level of attrition because of some of these values moments, and they won't stay unemployed long. They're going to go find a company that's more aligned because their first step was, I'm leaving. And even though the Great Resignation is sort of a old topic, it hasn't ended. People are still leaving companies without other jobs because they see that it goes against, it's that conflict with what they value. Um, so what companies have to do is actually start to really enhance the brand that really identifies what they care about now. Like, you have to invest. When I talk about reduction in spend, sure, we can reduce spend and the sheer number of hires, but this is where you need to double down on your DEI and B initiatives so that you could transform from inside out, right? And double down on talent brands so you can really tell the authentic story about your values and let the candidates select, which companies that they want to be a part of because of the story that you're telling. Yeah. All right. I want to go back to what you talked about before. You're talking about different generations within the market. And I remember when I started in talent in 1998, we talked about this notion that within 20 years, we're going to see a huge exodus of baby boomers leaving their job in highly skilled executive roles. And yet we don't have enough talent to replenish the talent leaving. And this is probably one of the reasons everyone's talking about the Great Resignation as to the reason why we have historic labor shortages. Literally, if you just break it down to the simplest factors, there's 2 jobs for every 1 qualified employee. And so this is one of the reasons why the Fed is worrying about do I raise interest rates? What do I do? And so on and so forth. But these generational shifts around, like boomers leaving, and then my generation leaving. Yes, I'm that old. And then millennials and Gen, like the new generation really starting to grow into leadership roles. From a practical lens, what's actually changing about the workplace culture, and how do candidate and employee expectations need to adapt?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a couple of ways to look at the generational shift in the workforce. I think part of it is that part of the reason for the gap is that people are leaving and sort of aging out and retiring, but we also know people are working later than they have previously. I think both of those things are true. Um, and, I go back to sort of people's needs in the workplace, just physically how they're able to do their jobs is really changing. I don't know if I think in terms of expectations, I think fundamentally what my generation values and what Gen Z values has shifted away from work. At COVID, what COVID taught us was that, and was particularly for those people who were in like essential roles, right? Was that like in some ways you were cogs in the machine. Like work is first, your well-being is second, and you have to sacrifice your well-being in order to have a job. And in the most dire circumstances, There are people who sacrifice their lives to show up at work. And even when we think about how we talk about COVID today, some people don't get sick leave for it. Some people are expected to come back after 5 days. People are just like, they don't feel like the organizations they work for really work for them. And they're looking elsewhere for that satisfaction. And I think when I think about how employers account for that and attract talent in that way, I think a lot of our conversation comes back here. We talked about greater flexibility. We talked about building trust. We talked about sticking to your values. We talked about making sure that when you're thinking about the employee experience and social responsibility, that's not just seen as an add-on. And I feel like this kind of ties it all together, because the generation that is coming up now is not a generation that has come up being able to trust their employer, being able to have long tenures with their employer, being able to necessarily always receive fair wages for their work, having social protections. I noticed that there was a discussion of benefits in the chat, having the benefits that they need, being certain that they're going to be able to retire. Like that, there's a lot of sort of instability that we are navigating, our generations are navigating, I think. And in a lot of ways, some of us are opting out. And I think if you want to pull people back in, I think recognizing that and building a culture that emphasizes trust, responsibility, employee engagement, and employee benefits, and recognizes that like that hustle grind, that hustle culture, that's done. You know what I mean? Like especially as we sort of see the startup ecosystem collapsing, the proof of concept, like it didn't work for a lot of people. It made a few people very rich. It didn't work for a lot of people. And we're not going to be able to do that again, at least not in the near future. So I think we just kind of have to like reimagine what this bargain is and shift these expectations to account for people who want more balance and who want to work for companies that they can trust.
Perfectly said. And only thing to add is I'm just so proud of this new workforce generation, because they're brave enough to talk about, really bringing their whole self to work. It was taboo when I started work to talk about mental health, to say that I've got way too much. It's just the world is crashing on me, and I need to take a break. And it's a requirement now. It's table stakes. If you don't have that within your organization, what I learned from you and what you just said is like, then you're at a disadvantage. Perfect. Well, we're right at the top of the hour, and Y-Vonne, as always, I love our conversations because I feel like we could just go for hours and hours and hours. So thank you for your time and amazing insights and inspiration, by the way.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone on the live stream into the Talent Visionaries event. This is stuff that hopefully sort of whets your appetite for future Talent Visionaries opportunities. Now, that said, there's a reason why Y-Vonne wrote a book. She's got phenomenal experience, phenomenal insights, all from the lens of how do we create equity and ensure justice and fairness in the workplace. So if you'd like to connect with Y-Vonne or learn more about her book, check out her company, ReadySet. I'm a customer, and you can find the link on the screen and in the chats. And then for future Talent Visionaries events, be on the lookout, subscribe, look for more of these things. All right. With that, thank you all. And thank you, Y-Vonne, again. Looking forward to hanging out sometime in person when things settle down. So
thank you. All right. Take care, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.